Hello and welcome to the first episode of the EnvirotechOnline podcast. I'm Jed Thomas, editor of EnvirotechOnline. We hope that this podcast will be your monthly catch-up on the most important developments in environmental monitoring, covering new trends, new technologies and new regulations. Joining me to discuss all of this is Alan Booth, who is senior editor here at ILM Media. Hello, Alan.
Hello, Jed, and thank you. I'm very pleased to be here at the start of this exciting new podcast venture for ILM Media.
Yes, well, it's definitely the right time to launch this podcast. The start of 2025 has seen two trends develop that I think will come to define the direction of the industry over the next few years. Weirdly enough, they're pulling in sort of opposite directions, these two trends. One calls for more monitoring, the other one wants less monitoring. Firstly, there's been the publication of a few important papers that are going to really influence how we think about climate change and climate change monitoring. Most notably, we've seen a report from Professor James Hansen, the godfather of climate change science, really, the theory of climate change, and another important publication by the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, which is the UK's professional body regulating actuarial science, like financial risk management. So both pieces of work have bolstered a long-standing trend in climatology that suggests that we might be a bit overly reliant on climate models that have shown to be pretty bad at predicting the sort of extreme climate events that we've seen over the last few years. So many climatologists, respected climatologists, are calling for a new climate monitoring regime that is far more extensive, real-time and legally consequential, and also one that's not just focused on temperature but focused on other things like tipping points. In other words, like a total overhaul of our present system. Now, the second headline trend is that major Western countries, the US, the European Union and the UK, may be entering an era of environmental deregulation, which could massively reduce demand for monitoring equipment in the near future.
Okay, well, I mean, when you come to talk about deregulation, I guess you're looking at the politics of it, so we'll get to that a little later on. First, can we start with the climate monitoring? You mentioned the idea to increase monitoring has been around for a while, but where did it come from?
Yeah, so there's been a sort of change in mainstream climate science over the last decade or so, and this change has two elements. It's about a criticism of modelling and a concern about tipping points, not just temperature. So let's start with the criticism of modelling. Some climatologists have criticised the types of climate models relied upon by the IPCC and later the Paris Agreement. They say they're missing certain dynamics, so they don't work as well as they should. They're basically too optimistic. They don't really match what we're seeing in the real world. And then there's concern over tipping points. The word that climate scientists might use is non-linearity, the fact that climate change is non-linear. Climate doesn't really just heat up gradually and then stop whenever we want it to stop, when we stop releasing greenhouse gases. There are certain points that we might cross with certain systems, like the Amazon rainforest, the glaciers and the ice sheets, and the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is a crucial part of moving heat about and nutrients as well for aquatic life. And we can cross tipping points in these systems at certain temperature levels, after which it becomes a sort of positive feedback loop and they sort of break down irreversibly. And there's no going back, there's no saving them. And when we lose these things, they have impacts on temperature, they have impacts on the weather system, which are permanent and can lead to further increases in temperature that hit further tipping points. And climate scientists call this a tipping point cascade, when one tipping point leads to a change that crosses another tipping point. This perspective, which has sort of been built up over the last 15 years, defines a sort of hard limit, a sort of binary success or fail for climate action. Either we avoid this cascade or we don't, basically. So it's not all about temperature rises, because there's quite a big range of temperatures where these tipping points can be crossed. We could be at 1.7 degrees and cross tipping points. We could be at 1.7 degrees and not cross tipping points. So it's about monitoring those, not just temperatures. So that's the change that you've seen in the last 10 years in climate science, is that we need more real-time monitoring to supplement modelling, and we need to keep our eye on metrics that are not just the global average surface temperature.
Okay, yeah, so we know that at the poles there's greater extremes of temperatures from temperature rises, and I've seen this North Atlantic anomaly that I think you're going to talk about later, where the surface temperature of the water has been increasing over the last couple of years. So anyway, please can you give the listeners some examples of this new perspective?
Absolutely. So, this is just my sort of narrative that I've put together here. I've started in 2015. There was a paper commissioned by the Foreign Office in the UK called Climate Change, a Risk Assessment. It was co-authored and headed up by Sir David King, who was formerly the UK's chief scientific advisor in the sort of Blair and Brown years, and then at this time in 2015 was a special representative for climate change to the Foreign Secretary. And this paper is quite significant because it was one of the first sort of big mainstream reports issued to governments that really did have a criticism of the modelling done by the IPCC and was very clear to foreground the non-linearity of climate change and the risks that it poses. In the foreword, Baroness Annalay, who is a Conservative peer at the moment but was Minister of State in the Foreign Office at the time, wrote that, and I'm quoting now, "Assessing the threat of climate change today demands a more coordinated, more sophisticated, more holistic approach." So that was the sort of first inkling in mainstream climate science that maybe we needed to change our perspectives and change our priorities. Then in 2023, around the sort of time when the North Atlantic anomaly that you've just been talking about was becoming big news and climate scientists were arguing about why this was, the North Atlantic anomaly was just an unexpected and significant rise in surface temperatures. Around this time in 2023, Professor James Hansen, who we've talked about, the sort of godfather of the theory of climate change, he co-authored a piece, a sort of open letter, with a bunch of his team, many of his frequent collaborators, called "Are We Acquiring the Data to Understand the Situation?" And it explored different elements of climate monitoring that he thought were underdeveloped, that they thought were underdeveloped. And they were underdeveloped in such a way that they were leaving us exposed to all of these sort of surprise leaps in temperature. In particular, they were talking about aerosols and cloud formation and the dynamics of that, which became very key to their understanding of what was driving the North Atlantic anomaly. And they state in the piece, and this is quoting them, "Although global monitoring of aerosol and cloud microphysics has been proposed, it has not been achieved." So this is related to their argument that the particles, the aerosols as they call them, that are released when you burn fossil fuels actually have a cooling effect. They scatter sunlight and they help to form low-level white clouds, which then reflect sunlight. And this has been something they've been toying with because, the possibility is that as we stop burning fossil fuels, we will also remove that cooling effect, and this could lead to a sort of net warming even as we decarbonise. And the feeling of Hansen's team is that this dynamic, the dynamic of cooling effects from aerosols released by burning fossil fuels, has not been properly included in the modelling that the IPCC has done and has made the predictions of warming that the IPCC has delivered relatively optimistic. Then last year, another important paper came out from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, which we've already talked about. They are the only UK organisation which regulates and represents actuaries and actuarial science, i.e. financial risk management. They're the voice of actuarial science in the UK. They published a report with faculty members at the University of Exeter called Climate Scorpion, The Sting is in the Tail. Now, what's really important about this report is it introduced into the conversation the concept of planetary solvency, and it's kind of a way of thinking about the natural world, the geophysical system, from a financial perspective, in a funny sort of way. The system's solvency, the climate system's solvency, is judged by, how many people it can support at what standard of living, in the same way that, a business's solvency might be judged by, can it afford for its operations, how long can it afford to run its operations.
Okay, Jed, so if I can paraphrase, what you're saying with planetary solvency is what people might have heard in the media, this idea of there's no planet B. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There are other ways, other terms that people use to describe it. They talk about carrying capacity. Yeah, it's just essentially a way of talking about the planet as a sort of economic system, what it produces, what it allows us to do, and talking about how it can support economies, support people. They think that if we use planetary solvency as a concept, we can then use the sort of techniques that they use in business and in finance to do risk management for the planet, basically.
So another thing that people might have heard of is this idea of donut economics by Kate Raworth, where we've got a certain range and you can sort of fall within that donut around what you're doing within certain sectors. But once you're outside of the top end, you really, really need to bring it back in to be able to have a sustainable future. So it's about sustainability as well.
Yeah, it's a sort of understanding that has been used in, the UN has sustainable development goals, and that's sort of roughly how they define them as well. So they were looking at that notion and doing risk assessment basically on the basis of that. And one of the authors of that paper was a professor from Exeter called Timothy Lenton, who's one of the pioneers of the study of climate tipping points. But it had support, this report from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries had support from luminaries like Professor Johan Rockström of the Potsdam Institute and also James Hansen. So it was a widely regarded report. And at one point it states unequivocally that a full risk assessment of climate change should be carried out in line with risk management best practices. This should be informed by a global warming experience analysis, up-to-date information on global warming, greenhouse gas levels, aerosol cooling, and other material factors that may influence temperatures. In other words, don't rely on models, keep track of what's actually going on, and make sure you're keeping an eye on other material factors like tipping points, basically. And speaking of tipping points and speaking of Professor Lenton, in 2024, he co-authored a peer-reviewed article that was published in Nature called Remotely Sensing Potential Climate Change Tipping Points Across Scales. Basically, what he was talking about in that is that we need smaller, more localized, higher resolution, fine-grained sensors to supplement satellite monitoring when it comes to keeping track of tipping points. He talks about combining observation, on the ground localized monitoring with Earth system models so that we can understand where we are with these tipping points, how much further we have, and just to improve our understanding of how close we're coming to these tipping points. So he had another important contribution to this conversation, which is relevant to the sort of regulatory legal dimension of it, in a pretty famous and quite scary report from 2022, which had a bunch of other superstars co-authoring, people like Will Steffen, Johan Rockström, and also Hans Joachim Schellnhuber. It was published in the American journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was called Climate Endgame, Exploring Catastrophic Climate Change Scenarios. Now, it's famous for a number of reasons, but the one that we really care about is the fact that it advocated for greater monitoring of tipping points along the lines that Lenton was just going into a minute ago. And it wants to give the results of this monitoring some more like bite, some more legal bite. It says that, and this is a quote, at the international level, there is the potential for a tail risk treaty, an agreement or protocol that activates stronger commitments and mechanisms when early warning indicators of potential abrupt change are triggered. So basically, this new trend in climate science wants more monitoring of things like tipping points, and it wants them to have a connection to the legal infrastructure of things like the Paris Agreement so that we don't sort of miss the wood for the trees. We don't focus too much on temperature and not focus on tipping points and end up, violating the Paris Agreement as a result.
That's scary. Can I ask if we're seeing any real-world investment into these types of monitoring efforts?
Yes, we are actually. I mean, taking it to the UK context for a second, last year in 2024, it was announced that, one of the government's sort of research institutions and funding institutions, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, most often called ARIA, was going to put up about £81 million to develop early warning systems for tipping points. So it's not just a sort of fringe scientific obsession, it's actually on the minds of governments and regulators.
So you mentioned earlier that so far in 2025 this year, the movement has been bolstered by some work released in the last few months. Can you tell me about that?
So yeah, there are two big papers that have been released in the first few months of this year, both from people and organisations that we've talked about already. And I think lots of these things will have made their way into headlines. So people that are listening probably heard about these things, second or third hand. James Hansen released a new paper, peer-reviewed article this time, called Global Warming Has Accelerated. This was released in February in the journal Environment. It's really the first real study of their hypothesis about aerosols, and it's taking a look at the regulations on shipping fuels to limit their sulfur content, which then limits the amount of aerosols that they produce, which therefore means there's less cooling effect over the oceans. And so this offered them a sort of real-world experiment to test their hypothesis about the sort of warming effects we might see as we decarbonise. And the results are quite troubling. They basically used these real-world experiments to explain the recent spike in temperature that we've seen over the last few years, taking into account the El Nino cycle. Here's Professor Hansen discussing the paper with the UN's Sustainable Development Goal Network.
So we must understand this situation better. Models used by IPCC are not realistic. The real world on the left has ocean cooling around Antarctica and a bit in the Arctic, but CMAP models don't get those. The cooling must be from ice melt, which they exclude or understate. So as a complement to IPCC modeling, we suggest using observed ice melt for the past and alternative projections for the future. And we also advocate for missing observations. There should be a fleet of autonomous Argo floats for under ice monitoring so we could see what is really going on.
In and of itself, This paper is a testament to the importance of increased monitoring of the real world and more fine-grained, targeted, higher resolution monitoring. So clearly we need to be looking deeper into the climate as we go forward if we're going to know how close we are to the sort of limits that we've set ourselves.
Just to sort of like ask a question about the kind of things that you're talking about monitoring. You mentioned the AMOC earlier on. My understanding is of that as the ice sheets melt off Greenland, and they're the largest landmass-based ice sheets in the Northern Hemisphere, we're tipping a lot of fresh water into the North Atlantic, changing how the water circulates in the North Atlantic, because a layering effect happens between the regular seawater, which is highly salinated, and then the fresh water, which tends to sit on top, consequently slowing down that recirculation. And the AMOC, which is often called or referred to partly as the Gulf Stream, that brings a lot of temperate weather that we experience in Western Europe up from the Gulf of Mexico. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, the kind of stuff that might have hit the headlines occasionally. I mean, I've read about it certainly in the press.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, in Professor Hansen's paper, he does mention, he sort of gives us updated prediction for when he thinks the AMOC might, well, the term they use is shut down. Yeah, he updates his prediction in that to bring it forward for the sort of next couple decades is when he thinks that we'll cross the tipping point for the AMOC and it will slowly shut down completely, which, as you've mentioned, will decrease temperatures in Western Europe, in Ireland, in the UK, Scandinavia, and Western continental Europe, but will lead to, it will add to temperatures in the rest of the world. So he does talk about tipping points in that paper. And he goes specifically into reiterating his point about we need more monitoring of aerosols and cloud microphysics. He proposes a satellite mission to do that. He says it's been explored in other papers, but hasn't been implemented. So he's calling for it to be implemented because his hypothesis is that this is a incredibly crucial part of the climate system, a dynamic that we're underexploring, we don't know enough about, and it could be incredibly consequential to meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement. So the second paper is from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and it's their first real planetary solvency assessment, and it's released in February as well, and published in conjunction with the University of Exeter. Tim Lenton's involved again in that. Now, it's a good chance that lots of the scarier headlines that you saw this month were lifted from this paper. It suggests we're on a path where we're facing the prospect of, hundreds of millions of deaths by 2050. So it's incredibly chilling reading. But for our purposes, the most crucial part is that they unequivocally state that we are lacking the information that we need to really deal with these risks. It says at one point, and I quote, "Climate assessments have consistently understated climate risks, meaning policymakers lacked information on the level of risk they accepted by agreeing the Paris goals of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius." Now, what they're talking about there is essentially tipping points. We've accepted that we want to keep temperatures below 1.5, but at the very least below 2 degrees of increase above pre-industrial levels. But within 1.5 and 2 degrees, that range, plenty of papers have come out to say that tipping points can occur within that range. And it says later on in the report that models do not fully capture all the complexities of the Earth system and assume no surprises, such as tipping points, deforestation, large fires, or increases in other greenhouse gases, like methane. There we have it, right from the horse's mouth. Both the money men, financial risk managers, and the scientific community think that we need to massively change our approach to monitoring the climate, to increase real-time monitoring, and to increase the sort of stuff, the scope, let's say, of what we're monitoring, and also the legal infrastructure, what that actually means for governments.
So we've actually seen that in the Arctic, or in sort of like the boreal forest, particularly across the north of Russia, with a lot of methane being released, a lot more than we had expected as the tundra starts to warm up and gas is released there from the frozen earth that we didn't really understand was being held in that part of the world. While we've seen some interest, as you've mentioned, aren't these warnings likely to fall on deaf ears given what we've been seeing lately from governments, particularly in the West?
Well, yeah, that is the worry.
Okay, so where should we start with that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, people listening, they're probably thinking of a very particular name that's probably right at the front of their minds.
Okay, let me take a wild guess then. Shall we start with President Donald J. Trump's first 50 days back in the White House? What have we seen?
Well, yeah, it's been a pretty busy month on that front. So we've seen lots of federal workers sort of losing their jobs, but we've seen big layoffs in departments, agencies involved in environmental monitoring, including federal land managers and people that work for the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which does most of the United States weather monitoring and climate monitoring. There are rumours about significant firing in the EPA as well. Reuters reported on the 27th of February that President Trump intends to cut the EPA's budget by 65%, which is a huge amount. We don't know if that's actually going to happen. But it's important to note that when this was said, it was actually as a clarification of an earlier statement where he was talking about cutting 65% of the staff of the EPA. So clearly there's an intention to massively change the capacity of the EPA to regulate and intervene on environmental issues. Now, in terms of industrial emissions monitoring, it's been reported that under the new leadership of Lee Zeldin, Trump's pick for head of the EPA is actually looking into getting rid of its 2009 endangerment finding. Now, the 2009 endangerment finding is kind of a central pillar of federal emissions regulation. It was a report done by the EPA into the sort of public health implications of greenhouse gas emissions. There have been plenty of people on the sort of Republican end of American politics who've been very interested in revisiting this finding as they think it's flawed. But yeah, it's considered kind of the sole basis for federal emissions regulation. So if it were to be the case that the EPA were to revisit and then find that it no longer agreed with the 2009 endangerment finding, we'd be looking at kind of a massive impairment of how even future administrations would be able to regulate emissions at a federal level. So it's likely to be a long battle. We don't actually know how this is all going to pan out, but the intention is there, and that says something. One of the most recent, sort of up to the minute moves has been the shutdown of America's global air quality monitoring program. The State Department is claiming that they're doing that for budgetary constraint reasons. It had about 80 US embassies and consulates around the world. They were monitoring air quality in the places that they were based, and it was important data for research and health authorities in those areas, including places like China, which have severe air pollution problems. That's the lay of the land at the moment. I mean, looking at it all in context, it's not really that surprising. In the first week of Trump's term, EnvirotechOnline published a deep dive into Trump's record environmental regulation and what we could expect his second term to look like. So it's not surprising. Lots of these policies and programs were hinted at in Trump's first term, and plenty of the things he was saying on the campaign trail and the people that he's aligned himself with have been saying exactly these things for quite a while.
And of course, it's consequential because of the 180 reverse that the Trump administration is doing compared to the work that the Biden administration put together in moving towards the electrification of the grid and sustainable production of electricity, that sort of activity. And of course, because America, the United States, has been the largest national emitter of greenhouse gases for very many decades now, with about a quarter of what we see globally being attributable to the US. But I mean, this is a bigger issue than even Trump's agenda, isn't it? We've seen the US Supreme Court move in the direction of deregulation over the past few years as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that is part of the more troubling aspect of this, is that it isn't just Trump. It really is a far longer lasting shift in the regulatory environment. And there's a few examples of these Supreme Court rulings from recent years and how they're quite aligned with what Trump's trying to do. In his first term, Trump repealed an Obama-era rule that expanded the number of wetlands and waterways that were protected under the Clean Water Act. It basically removed protections for ephemeral streams and isolated wetlands, i.e. sort of feeder streams. If you're regulating a particular river or lake, this kind of removed protections for monitoring in the streams that led into that, and also wetlands that weren't connected to other aspects of the hydrosphere. It was criticised at the time by the Scientific Advisory Board as not being consistent with EPA established science or the key objectives of the Clean Water Act itself. This repeal was reversed under the Biden administration, but in 2023, which is still under Biden, the Supreme Court in Sackett v. EPA delivered a ruling that was quite similar to this repeal, where they said that the Clean Water Act only applied to wetlands with a continuous surface connection to regulated bodies of water. And now, in the last few weeks, we've seen San Francisco versus EPA.
This just in, the Supreme Court has struck down rules regulating the discharge of water pollution. It narrows the landmark Clean Water Act. San Francisco sued the EPA after the city was accused of violating certain guidelines for discharging sewage into the Pacific Ocean.
The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the EPA cannot impose strict federal regulations on sewage discharge. This limits the oversight that the federal government has and the EPA has on municipal wastewater systems, which, along with this sort of deregulation of various bodies of water, essentially turns a blind eye to lots of pollution that might find its way into incredibly important drinking water sources and just into rivers and things like that. Okay, now on air quality, the Supreme Court last year blocked the Good Neighbour rule, which is basically about the responsibility of states to curb air pollution that crosses state lines. It also prevents the EPA from enforcing nitrogen oxide reductions in 23 states, essentially meaning that it's not regulating the pollutant that can lead to acid rain. Since Supreme Court justices serve for life pretty much, we're likely to see a deregulation agenda persisting for quite a few years, like even beyond Trump and his successors. This is kind of a sea change for the foreseeable future in the regulation of environmental pollution.
Yeah, and of course, we've got to remember that in his first term, President Trump had 3 picks for the Supreme Court who have proved to be conservative-leaning justices. Okay, I'm ready to reach for the hopium right now. Please tell me there's better news out of Europe.
Well, I think this image of the EU as being, the sane and level-headed lot, opposed to, the extreme of the US, is kind of over, potentially. I mean, there's a chance that it might be over. We'll see how things go. But, there's news this week that the EU's omnibus simplification package is going through, and this is, in essence, just a broad scale reduction in the sustainability reporting requirements that businesses have to follow. It's reduced the number of companies that have to report their sustainability by about 80%. It's pushed back the deadlines that they have to report by, and it's changed things like upstream reporting. Previously, businesses in the EU had to sort of incorporate the sustainability of their suppliers into their sustainability impact assessments, but they no longer really have to do that unless their suppliers are large enough to be covered under this regulation. Risk assessments will be conducted every 5 years instead of annually, and like I said, then companies are no longer legally liable for environmental or human rights violations linked to their supply chains. And this is all part of a wider trend across Europe that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years that I can give you a taste of. There's the planned phase out of combustion engine vehicles has faced quite a bit of resistance. The current deadline is 2035, but there are plenty of parties, including Italy's leading party at the moment, who want to push that back even further.
Okay, if I can just clarify there, when you did mention about phasing out internal combustion engines, that was, of course, the date that's been set for the sale of ICE and vehicles rather than actually every car that's on the road, which, of course, in general is even worse news, given that cars can have a 20-year lifespan.
And we've seen in the UK that we've pushed back our phasing out of combustion engine vehicles as well. There's also the proposal to halve pesticide use. Plenty of pesticides are environmental pollutants. It's been completely scrapped after farmer protests. Carbon pricing policies, carbon pricing is there to discourage and disincentivize the burning of fossil fuels, are being delayed or scaled back. And there are legal challenges to nitrogen emissions regulations. Again, this is to do with farming and farmer resistance. The government in the Netherlands was planning on closing about 3,000 high emission farms, but that is unlikely to happen, and the emissions reductions are unlikely to happen as well. So there is a general trend in the European Union towards the deregulation of pollution, and this is likely to have an impact on the demand for monitors and instruments for monitoring environmental pollution.
Right, so not a lot to be optimistic about there. So I think I've learned my lesson, but shall I ask you if there's any good news from the UK? Can you tell me what's happening over here?
That's a bit more up in the air. The environmental strategy of the UK government is still kind of like taking shape. It hasn't made the most concerted effort to lay that out. So it's unclear what will happen. I mean, with things like river pollution, we don't know whether monitoring requirements will be strengthened. We don't know whether the Environment Agency will be given the resources to enforce or to investigate. We've seen lots of cuts to the Environment Agency over the last decade or so. So we don't really know. There's only sort of indications from other aspects of their policy. Planning permissions is the big one. We've seen indication that there's going to be a deregulation of planning permissions, and deregulation specifically in the dimension of sort of environmental monitoring, biodiversity monitoring, things like this, in a bid, they say, to increase the construction of housing and infrastructure. So here's Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves speaking in January of this year about changes to planning permissions.
Last week, we confirmed our priorities for the Planning and Infrastructure Bill: to rapidly streamline the process for determining applications, to make the consultation process far less burdensome, and to fundamentally reform our approach to environmental regulation. The problems in our economy, the lack of bold reform that we have seen over decades, can be summed up by a £100 million bat tunnel built for HS2. The type of decision that has made delivering major infrastructure in our country far too expensive and far too slow. So we are reducing the environmental requirements placed on developers when they pay into a nature restoration fund that we have created, so they can focus on getting things built and stop worrying about the bats and the newts.
So what we can take from this, and this is reading into it a bit, there may be fewer requirements to monitor and test for certain parameters when applying for planning permission. We don't know exactly what sort of corners will be cut, but recent reports of impending budget cuts are unlikely to give the Environment Agency the resources it needs to investigate and check and do all of these things. So we don't know what's going to happen, but there's kind of a trend here of them joining in with deregulation in maybe a more subtle way, not as direct, but there we go.
Yeah, but I mean, given that the changes to planning have been sort of foreseen as a boon to house building, I mean, there's an opportunity for good news there if we start to build houses to passive house standards, given that the UK's housing stock is where most of its carbon emissions come from. But yeah, not a lot of good news. I think we're in desperate need of a positive note to end on. Have you got anything up your sleeve?
Only that there's still lots of great work going on. Lots of stuff for monitoring professionals to sink their teeth into. But if you want to keep up to date in this rapidly changing world, there's no better place than EnvirotechOnline. We've got a whole host of webinars, interviews and presentations already up there and lots in the pipeline. So head on over there, join our community for free, giving you access to hours of exclusive and expert-led articles and lectures. So if you're going to find any good news, you'll find it on EnvirotechOnline.
That sounds like a plan.
Yep, all right then. That's it for this first edition of the EnvirotechOnline podcast. If you don't want to miss another episode, make sure to follow or subscribe or whatever you have to do on your preferred podcast platform. Say that 3 times fast. Whatever you have to do on your preferred podcast platform to get an alert when we post another episode. Until next time then, cheers Alan.
Thanks, Jade. Goodbye from me.